So it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker this morning, who is Professor René van Woudenberg from the Free University of Amsterdam, whom we had the pleasure of hearing yesterday and hearing in the panel discussion last night. And this morning, his subject is the presuppositions of science, the Bible, and Christian faith. Professor René.
Yesterday I spoke on the subject of limitations of science, and one of the things I tried to argue was that science has certain presuppositions, has certain limitations, and one type of limitation is that science proceeds from certain presuppositions or assumptions that cannot be scientifically established themselves. There's nothing strange or nothing wrong with that, but it's a fact that needs to be acknowledged if we are interested in obtaining a proper view of science and the scientific enterprise. It's on that theme that I will be continuing this morning. I'll be talking about presuppositions of a couple of presuppositions of science. Yesterday I mentioned only one. I went over it fairly quickly. Now I'll go over it in some more depth. Now, whenever people use the word presupposition, they may mean various different things. Or another way to put it is that when people speak about presuppositions of something, they may have in mind very different kinds of animals. On the handout, I specify 4 kinds of animals that the word presupposition may refer to. So it's possible, an actual fact that various philosophers have thought about presuppositions in different ways. One way is to think about a presupposition is that some statements presuppose certain other statements. And there are 3 different ways in which you can do that. So on the handout at number 3, I call it I develop one notion of a presupposition. So it's as I said, it's a relation between statements. One statement can presuppose another statement. Suppose there's a statement P. A statement P may presuppose a statement Q when the following is the case: that if statement Q is false, then P is false as well. So the statement John was at home this morning presupposes that somebody was home this morning. Right? Because if somebody was home this morning is false, then John was at home this morning will be false as well. Right? So statement P presupposes Q when the following is the case. If Q were false, then so would P be. That's one notion of a presupposition. But there's another one. I call that a B. So this is what I call an A presupposition. I could have given it a more fancy name, but I wasn't so creative at the time. I was making these distinctions, but an A presupposition is the name for today. There are also what I call B presuppositions. Again, it's a relation between statements, a statement P and a statement Q. And the idea is that statement P presupposes statement Q when the following is the case. If Q is false, then belief in or acceptance of P would be unjustified or wouldn't be warranted. So, right, statement P, statement Q. If Q is false, then acceptance of P wouldn't be justified or wouldn't be warranted. Here's an example. If someone bases his or her belief that Susan is an insecure person on the basis of the outcome of a Rorschach test, which is a somewhat older test that psychologists use to measure or to capture some personality traits. It basically consists of somewhat vague, amorph lines or colored surfaces, and then people are asked to associate on what they are seeing. So I read a book about an American psychologist who used the Rorschach test on Hermann Göring, whom he had to work with. And so Hermann Göring associated all sorts of military associations, which seems not too surprising. But he was able, the psychologist thought, he was able to say something interesting about the personality traits of Göring through the application of the Rorschach test. So, if someone bases his belief that Susan is an insecure person on the basis of the outcome of a Rorschach test, then the statement, the Rorschach test is a reliable test for personality traits, is a presupposition of that person's belief. Right? If that statement about a Rorschach test is false, then the belief this person is insecure would no longer be warranted or would no longer be justified. So that's another type of presupposition. Now there are also what I call C presuppositions. Again, it's a relation between two statements, P and Q, and P presupposes Q when the following is the case. If Q is false, then P is neither true nor false. Here's an example that philosophers have talked a lot about. Here's the statement, the present king of France is bald. Well, is this, the present king of France is bald presupposes France presently has a king. Now, the idea is if France presently does not have a king, then the statement, the present king of France is bald, is neither true nor false. So this thing here, the present king of France is bald, can only be true or false if France presently has a king. But if France has no king, then it can neither be true nor false. So that's a much more involved notion of a presupposition. I call it a C presupposition. Now there is another sort of presupposition that's not a relation between statements, but it's a relation between an activity, a practical activity, and a statement. And statement P, as I say on the handout, is a presupposition of an activity provided one cannot sensibly engage in that activity and deny P. So one example would be the following. The activity of playing tennis has as one of its presuppositions the statement that balls can be hit by rackets. What this means is that it is somehow incoherent, very strange, incoherent. To play tennis, or for someone to play tennis and deny that balls can be hit by rackets. That would be very strange. It's a presupposition of the practice that this thing is true, that balls can be hit by rackets. And there are many, or all practices that we are engaged in have some sorts of presuppositions of this kind. So it's not a relation between statements, but here activities, kinds of activities, have specific presuppositions. Here's another example. The activity of making someone a promise presupposes the statement that promises ought to be kept. So I make a promise to give a talk somewhere, and that has, I claim, as a presupposition, the statement, or I give a talk, I make the promise to give a talk, and it has as a presupposition that promises ought to be kept. Because it would be very strange, it would be in a way incoherent to make the promise and say, and by the way, promises ought not to be kept. That would be incoherent. If someone says that, then you cannot coherently engage in the activity of making promises. Now likewise, the activity of doing science has a number of presuppositions. Presuppositions that you cannot, also presuppositions of this D type, presuppositions that you cannot deny when you are doing science and scientific research. And these are what I call science's presuppositions. Now I single out for this talk presupposition of science can be divided in three broad categories. I call them metaphysical, epistemological, and axiological presuppositions. Metaphysical presuppositions, I start there. Metaphysical presuppositions are presuppositions about the world. And I'll discuss two such presuppositions. Our world is an orderly world. When we do science, we must presuppose that the world that we study is an orderly world, that it displays patterns of regularity and constancy. The world here and now, we must presuppose when we are doing science, behaves in ways that are identical to the ways it behaves at other places and at other times as well, in the past. This presupposition lies at the basis of the many inductive procedures that we use in doing science. Of course, prior to investigation, we don't know what is regular and what is constant in nature. But we do and must presuppose that nature, or at least that much of it, or at least much of it, we must leave space for forms of randomness, is regular and constant if we are to do science. To see this, suppose we didn't make that assumption. Suppose, for instance, that we didn't assume that human muscles in similar conditions and similar contexts would behave similarly. Then we could not arrive at general conclusions about the behavior of human muscles. But we do arrive at such general conclusions, and we arrive at them through induction. We generalize over a limited number of observations of, in my peculiar example, of muscular behavior, such as noticing that repetitive, unaccustomed, eccentric contractions damage muscle fibers, and they cause inflammation and delayed onset muscle soreness. Right? This is just one type of example out of many other possible ones. And we conclude on the basis of these sorts of phenomena that this holds for muscles of a particular kind more generally. But this inductive step can only be made because we presuppose that the world, the muscular world, so to speak, is identical over time and over space. A world without regularity or constancy is a world that would change from moment to moment, without there being any patterns to discern in the series of changes. It's a world that would surprise us constantly. It's a world without natural laws. And laws are, of course, the icons of regularity and constancy. It's also a world in which prediction would be impossible. But it is part and parcel of many sciences that they make predictions. And in order for this to be possible, scientists must presuppose that the world displays regularity and constancy. Many theists have argued that the patterns of regularity and constancy can best be understood against the backdrop of, or is best explained by reference to, God's constancy and faithfulness to his creation. Now, whether or not one adopts a theistic account of patterns of regularity and constancy, the belief that these patterns exist, that they are real, that is a presupposition of science. It is a thesis that itself is not a product of scientific investigation, and that's why it's so aptly named a presupposition of science. Now, the statement, the world is an ordered world, surely is a deep presupposition of the scientific activity. For it would be incoherent to engage in research and explicitly deny that statement. It would be very strange for someone to engage in investigation as to how muscles behave and say, and by the way, I don't believe muscles behave in regular ways. So what I claim is the world is an orderly world is a de-presupposition of the scientific activity. But it's also of many scientific individual statements. It's also a B presupposition, for if it would be false that the world is a regular place, or is a place that displays regularities, then we would have no evidence for any general scientific statement whatsoever. Those statements would lose their justification and warrant. So this is my first example of a metaphysical presupposition of science. I now turn to a second one. This is a presupposition that certainly among philosophers is a highly, or that's a topic that has been seen or has received a lot of discussion. Less so among scientists. They tend to accept this much more easily or tend to agree with me on this. But when I talk about these things with my philosophical colleagues in my own department, for instance, then they tend to shake their weary heads. The presupposition is this: truths exist independently of any human beings believing them or knowing them or affirming them or entertaining them. Truths exist, so to say, mind independently. Whether something is true or false doesn't depend, is the idea, on anybody knowing it, that truth, anybody believing the truth, anybody entertaining the truth. The proposition maybe, or the statement, or the thought may have never entered anybody's mind. But truths exist independently of us. Now, a statement S is true if and only if the world is the way that statement says it is the case. The statement that lemons are sour, that lemons are sour, is true if and only if lemons are indeed sour. Nothing more is needed, and nothing less will suffice for the truth of the statement, lemons are sour. So even when no one would know that lemons are sour, it would still be the case that lemons are sour. Even if no one believed it, no one entertained the proposition, it would still be the case. And for the truth of a proposition or for the truth of a theory, it's not needed, it's not required that anybody believes the theory or knows it. A theory is true or false independently of what you and I think about it. At least that's what I'm going to claim. Of course, in order for us to know truth, we must exist. We must be there. But in order for the truth to exist, our existence is not needed. To see this, let's engage in a little thought experiment. So Tim also engaged us yesterday in a couple of thought experiments. Here's another one. I take it from the great German philosopher Edmund Husserl. He says, suppose that through, or this is my personal take on his thought experiment. Suppose that through some unhappy course of events in the year 2020, no human beings exist anymore. Perhaps an atomic rain has extinguished all human life on Earth. Now concentrate on that world in 2020 and ask yourself the question, would there still be truths in 2020? The correct answer would seem to be, yes, of course, there would be truth. It would still be true that water evaporates in an open container in that world, or in 2020. And it would still be true in 2020 that two heavy objects attract each other with a force that's directly proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them, etc. That would still be true. Of course, in 2020, none of these truths would be known by anybody, accepting God and other possibly non-human intelligent beings. But this fact doesn't rob these truths of their very existence. The annihilation of human beings doesn't bring with it the annihilation of all truths. It isn't the case that when all human beings go, all truths go as well. Now, why should we think that this idea is a presupposition of science? Why should we think that the mind independentness of truth is a presupposition of science? Well, it seems to me for the following reason. Unless we assume that there is a truth about what causes, for instance, smallpox, scientific research into the causes of smallpox has no clear aim. It's because we believe there is a truth about the causes of smallpox. Even if we don't know what that truth is, the truth exists. And we're trying to figure out what the truth is by doing research. Unless we assume that there is a truth about whether a physically active lifestyle is healthy or not, scientific investigation into the health effects of regular physical activity is pointless. There is a truth about the matter. We don't know what the truth about the matter is, and so we do research in it. We presuppose there is a truth about this. Again, prior to scientific inquiry, we don't know what the truth is about these things, but we do and we must assume that they exist. That truth exists, or that truths exist, is therefore, I say, a presupposition of science, not the result thereof. And it is a depresupposition. For you cannot coherently engage in scientific research and at the same time deny that truths exist. And it will also seem to be a B presupposition of science. For if truth doesn't exist, belief in or acceptance of scientific claims would be pointless. Why would I accept a statement offered by a scientist if the scientist doesn't claim it is a true one, or if it's a likely to be true one? So that seems to me to be a second metaphysical presupposition of science. Truths exist. Whether or not we entertain those truths, whether or not we know them, or whether or not we believe them. Of course, we do science because we want to get on the right track. We want to track truth. But the truths are there, in a way, sovereignly awaiting for us, or to become known by us. Science also has what I call epistemological presuppositions. Epistemological presuppositions are presuppositions that concern human knowers, or human beings qua knowers, human beings qua cognizers. I go over two such presuppositions. Human beings, we think, are capable of acquiring knowledge. Right? We think we know, and in fact we do know many things. We know our names, we know what we had for breakfast this morning, we know that 2 + 2 = 4, we know that the world is pretty old, we know that some people are taller than some other people, we know that there are bald kings, and we know many other things as well. Now, we cannot do science unless we do presuppose that we are capable of acquiring knowledge. That we are capable of acquiring knowledge of the objects that we are studying. To know something, for example, to know that human hearts are partly composed of striated muscles, means to have true beliefs about the composition of human hearts that are well founded. So in order to do science, we must presuppose that we are capable of acquiring well-founded and true beliefs about the objects that we study. Now, it is theoretically possible that we are incapable of knowing truth, of knowing things. That's theoretically possible. We can think up a scenario, or we can think of a world in which there are truths, but we are really dramatically incapable of getting acquainted with any of them. Some skeptics, some philosophical skeptics, for example, they have argued that truth is an illusion, and hence that none of our beliefs can be true. And of course, if none of our beliefs is true, then we cannot have knowledge at all. Now, we like to claim that we have true beliefs, but these claims, these skeptics say, are no more than somewhat hidden exertions of power. So I'm thinking here of Nietzsche and of Foucault, who say that making truth claims really is just an exertion of power. When scientists and when professors tell us things, they don't tell us these things because they hold them true, but because they want to exert power. It may be hidden from their own mind that's what they're actually doing, but a real good look at what's going on reveals that that's what's going on. Making truth claims means exerting power, or is the exertion of power, and nothing more. But these philosophers, I truly think, are mistaken. What they are in fact doing is engaging in a battle in which what counts is not the way the world is, or at least that's what they say, but how effective they are in manipulating the convictions of others. Now, this is the Nietzschean denial of knowledge. Now, other skeptics have argued not that truth is non-existent, as these people have been claiming, and that hence knowledge is impossible because knowledge requires truth. But that none of our beliefs, even if they happen to be true, are well-founded, not even the scientific ones. The argument offered is this: it is theoretically possible that we are constantly deluded by an evil demon who feeds our minds with experiences of the sort that we are so thoroughly familiar with. You are now listening to a voice. You feel that you have clothes on. You feel that you are sitting on a chair, that you have shoes on. You are familiar with the lighting conditions, or you have certain light sensations or perceptual sensations. Says the skeptic, all these experiences might be fed to us by an evil demon. We aren't really sitting here. You aren't really sitting on your chair. Perhaps you're lying in a bed, but that evil demon is feeding you with the sensations as of sitting on a chair, having clothes on, having your shoes on, listening to a voice, perceiving the lights around. These experiences are given to you, and they are qualitatively indistinguishable from how we think this, or from how we think that the situation we are in really is. Right? We could all be trapped into a matrix scenario. That's the thought. Now, you can never exclude the possibility that you are the victim of such an evil demon. We can never exclude the possibility that we are trapped in a matrix scenario. After all, what could be our evidence for thinking that these possibilities don't occur? Experiences cannot be of any help here. For all of our experiences, or all of your experiences, may be fed to you by an evil demon. All of our experiences may be included in the matrix scenario. Science cannot help you here either. For apart from experiences, we have no other sorts of evidence that can help us decide whether or not our experiences are genuine or no. And science is based on human experiences. There can be no science without humans who have experiences. But if we cannot exclude the possibility that we are deluded, then it follows that we don't really know anything. For then none of our beliefs is safe or certain. And it is somehow contradictory or strange to say that we know that the Earth has one moon, but that we might be wrong. And because we cannot exclude skeptical scenarios. Now we must acknowledge, or at least I think I acknowledge, that although the skeptical arguments don't compel us, they don't compel me for a minute, they are certainly not trivial. And what we can learn from the history of philosophy is that certain kinds of skeptical arguments are well nigh irrefutable. What this means is that we cannot establish that we are indeed capable of knowing things. We cannot establish that we are capable of knowing the objects that we investigate by doing science. We cannot, in other words, scientifically establish that we are capable of knowledge. And that's why I say that it's a presupposition of science that we are capable of acquiring knowledge. It's not something that we can scientifically establish, nor, I add, philosophically establish. This is a point, in a way, a point of faith. This is what we trust we are capable of doing. Now that we are capable of knowledge then, that's a presupposition of science. And it is clearly a depresupposition, for it is incoherent to engage in scientific research and yet deny that we are capable of knowing anything. But it's also a B-type presupposition. For if we are incapable of knowing things, then belief or acceptance of the scientific theories is no longer justified or warranted. A related presupposition that we have to make if we are to take and to do science in a serious manner is to say, and here we again move into a topic that was broached yesterday as well. We must, if we are to engage in science, we must presuppose that the means, that our faculties that we are endowed with are reliable, or more or less reliable, or certainly not massively deceived, that we aren't massively deceived by them. Now a faculty like reason or perception or memory is reliable when it conjures up in us a relatively high proportion of true beliefs. So if a faculty that we have produces in 50% of its operations true beliefs and in 50% of its operations false beliefs, then that would be a radically unreliable faculty. So if a faculty is to be reliable, it must turn out a rather high percentage of true beliefs. That's what we mean, that's what I mean when I say, or when I talk about the reliability of a faculty. Now it's a presupposition of science, I say, that the faculties we use in order to do science must be reliable. Not perfectly reliable, not 100% reliable, none of our faculties is, but they must be pretty reliable. It is a presupposition for that our faculties are reliable is not something that we can establish, not even scientifically establish in any way. Any argument we can think of for the conclusion that say sense perception is reliable, that is as Tim again yesterday, he gave a very quick, he ran that argument very quickly, and I won't redo it. Any argument to that effect is in a way presupposing the reliability of the faculty itself. So what Tim yesterday said about perception, I will now make the same point for our reasoning faculty. Now consider the following argument for the conclusion that our faculty of reasoning, our ability to reason, is reliable and so trustworthy. Now, the faculty of reasoning you can think of as the faculty that enables us to make inferences, to draw implications. Suppose we see that John won the match, and we conclude from that someone won the match. Right? That's a valid conclusion. If John won the match, then someone won the match. That follows. Or suppose we say 2,176 minus 1,387 equals 789. You can do the calculation. You see that it follows. That's a form of reasoning. Or suppose someone says, this is real, hence it's possible. So, blonde kings exist, which is true because the Dutch king is blonde, and so I know it. He was a former pupil of mine, by the way. Blonde kings exist, hence blonde kings are possible. That just follows. If something is real, then it's possible. We see that it follows. That's a logical conclusion. Or if we say, if A finished the race before B, and B finished the race before C, then A finished the race before C. That follows. Or if we say all human beings are mortal, Socrates is a human being, hence Socrates is mortal, that follows. Now consider the following argument. From John won the match, I deduce someone won the match, and rightly so. No mistake there. Or 2 multiplied by 2 makes 4. Right? I make the deduction, and rightly so, because 2 times 2 equals 4. And from this is real, I conclude this is possible, and rightly so, because that is a valid inference. And now I make a generalization, hence the faculty of reasoning is reliable. Now this conclusion, the faculty of reasoning is reliable, on the basis, if I draw this conclusion on the basis of this particular argument, well, in a way, I am all the time already presupposing that the faculty is reliable, because I cannot have my first premise, namely, if John won the match, then someone won the match. Well, that was already a premise that I won through the application of my of reason. So, unless I presuppose that the conclusion is true, I cannot even accept the premises. Now, the point to make about this argument is not that it's logically invalid. It's a perfectly acceptable inductive conclusion. Nor is the point that the argument is logically circular. It isn't that, so an argument is logically circular when the conclusion is already among the premises. But that's not the case here. I know I had as my premises logical reasoning is valid, or reason is valid. That was not among the premises. Still, some form of circularity is operative here. The point to make about these arguments, or about this argument, is that it's circular in another sense. The argument is what philosophers have called epistemically circular, by which they mean you cannot accept the premises unless you have already committed yourself to the truth of the conclusion. And the argument I gave just has this feature. You cannot accept the conclusion, you cannot accept the premises of that little argument unless you have committed yourself to the truth of the conclusion that reason is is a valid or is reliable faculty. Now, since we cannot do science without assuming that our belief-forming faculties like reason, like perception, are reliable, and since we cannot establish in a fully non-circular way that our faculties are reliable, it follows that it is a presupposition of science that our faculties are reliable. And it is, of course, a presupposition of the scientific activity. You cannot it's incoherent to fully engage in science and say, and by the way, my faculties are unreliable. It would be incoherent for a mathematician to say, here's my mathematical work, and by the way, my reasoning faculty or reasoning is a fallacious way of going about. A little bit as a side point, but related to this. So I've now covered two epistemological presuppositions of science. It's still good on track, but I'm broadening the road a bit. So we human beings have many belief-forming mechanisms, or we are endowed with many faculties, as they might be called. I've mentioned perception, I've mentioned memory, reasoning, testimony. There's proprioception, right? We know where our limbs are, even if we aren't looking where they are. We have sort of internal feeling as to where our bodily parts hang out, so to speak. And there are other sources of knowledge that have been identified. Yesterday evening, during the panel discussion, I mentioned the sensus divinitatis, a source or a faculty that we may have by means of which we may become aware of God's existence. Other philosophers have argued for the existence of a moral sense, through the operation of which we may come to know moral truth. And now there is a point, it's a bit beside, it's not beside the point, it's an important point. The point I now want to make is this. Sometimes it is said that naturalism is a presupposition of science. Now what I want to say about this is the following. Science as we now know it draws on all of these sources of knowledge that I've mentioned, except for the moral and the religious ones. And this constellation is sometimes called methodological naturalism. And under the reign of methodological naturalism, when doing science, we refrain from references to substantive moral values, as well as to God or to religious convictions. Methodological naturalism is in a way a form of self-limitation. It is a policy not to draw on moral and religious sources when we are doing science. And there may be sound pragmatic reasons for adopting methodological naturalism. However, often people go on and draw far-reaching metaphysical conclusions from this self-imposed limitation. Or they forget that they are self-imposed limitations. For they go on to argue that since science doesn't tell us about morals, nor about God, and since science is the most successful cognitive project in human history, we should conclude that morality is an illusion, that God doesn't exist, and that belief in God is anti-scientific and irrational. Now what these people like Alex Rosenberg, Richard Dawkins, and many others, what these people are in fact saying is that naturalism, and not just methodological naturalism, but metaphysical naturalism, is a presupposition of science. And the alleged presupposition is that the following: the only things that exist are things that science can tell us about. It seems to me clear that naturalism, thus conceived, is certainly not a presupposition of science. It certainly is not incoherent to engage in scientific inquiry and yet deny naturalism thus defined. You can fully engage in a scientific project and say, and by the way, I deny that the only things that exist are the things that science can tell us about. That's not incoherent in the way that many of the other things are. Right? So it's not incoherent, and hence it's not a presupposition of science. That's the point I was making. Finally, axiological or normative presuppositions. I'll be rather quick here. I'm only going to talk about presupposition number 2 on the handout, that we ought to comply to a number of ethical rules in scientific conduct. Now, these presuppositions, these moral presuppositions, they concern agents that on a day-to-day basis are actually doing scientific research. These norms are norms that hold for actual scientific practitioners. And these presuppositions concern what is required for scientific integrity. Now, I should say that I'm involved in a big project in Amsterdam on research integrity. So it's an epistemic responsibility of universities to foster research practices that are ethically sound. And we all know, I think yesterday it came to pass, or we talked a little bit about the replication crisis. So in certain areas of social psychology, certain areas of behavioral economics, certain areas in the life and medical sciences, there is a replication crisis. So studies have conjured up results, and the results simply cannot be replicated given the same data and given the same methods. So we were involved in an Amsterdam-wide project, so all the academic Amsterdam institutions are involved in that, and we are investigating what might be helpful for what might improve research climates in which such a replication crisis could not occur, because a replication crisis has to do, or is caused by, all sorts of sloppy ways of doing science, unclear research protocols, on making methodological or methodic shortcuts, and there are many things that go into a healthy research climate. Actually, we made a list of 60 academic sins that are regularly committed by academics, and we are calculating the impact on how negatively do certain misbehaviors impact the system of science. So that's a whole a very important thing. But in a sort of backhanded way, it shows that science is a deeply morally and normatively based enterprise. There is such a thing as the ethics of doing science. And here are just a couple of things. So such an ethics of science may be formulated in terms of injunctions that researchers must heed, and that are such that if they don't do their work in that way, then the practice of the science as a whole will deteriorate. Here are some examples. Don't fabricate data. Don't hide data that don't support the theory that you are developing. Be open-minded and careful. Be cooperative, communicative. Try to make sure that you are able to engage in genteel discussion, able to deal with objections, able to foresee possible future objections. Don't suggest in public that your results are stronger than they in fact are. Don't plagiarize. Acknowledge the possibility that you might be wrong, as the results are mostly preliminary. Well, there are also ethical codes of conduct, so we were also involved in writing the new Dutch research code of conduct. It was actually an interesting but also a difficult enterprise. But now there is a new there's a new version, and it's widely accepted. The point to see is that scientific inquiry itself isn't going to tell us what these norms are. What the norms for research integrity are, science itself is not going to tell us. We need other sources for that. And that's why I call them presuppositions of science. And these presuppositions in this rubric are neither A presuppositions, nor B presuppositions, nor C presuppositions, but they are of kind number D. For it is, in a way that I won't try to specify now in any detail, it is incoherent to engage in scientific research and yet deny that these norms must be heeded, or deny that these are the norms for good research. So, what I've been trying to argue is science, there are different notions of presuppositions. Science has presuppositions of at least 3 types, A types, B types, and D types. Science has metaphysical presuppositions, epistemological presuppositions, and I only scratched the surface of the normative presuppositions. When you look at these presuppositions, that will be my final point, then it seems to me that these presuppositions comport so beautifully with biblical teachings. I draw attention to the fact that the orderliness of the world from a Christian perspective has to do with God's constancy and his regular dealings with the world. That our truth fits beautifully in the biblical view of the world. These moral presuppositions, or these normative presuppositions, they are in a way just ethical presuppositions of the sort that are sustained by and that we are challenged to live by through the biblical writings. And also the epistemological presuppositions. How can it be that we can make these epistemological presuppositions, for instance the ones about the reliability of our faculties, well, that comports beautifully with the belief that we are divinely created, and that we may trust in God's goodness, also when we are trusting our own, and we're relying on our own faculties. So that's what I wanted to say this morning. Thank you very much.